So, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's seminar on the Nordic countries and European integration, held here at the CEVRO Institute College. First of all, I would like to express my sincere thanks for the participation and support to the all Nordic embassies, namely the Royal Danish Embassy in Prague, the Embassy of Finland in Prague, the Embassy of Iceland in Vienna, the Royal Norwegian Embassy in Prague, and the Embassy of Sweden in Prague. My appreciation also goes to the young conservatives in the Czech Republic, and especially to Hans Seidel Stiftung for co-sponsoring today's event. Let me say a few words about this conference. It was the early beginning of February when I came with the idea of organizing such a project. First, I asked Mr. Brunclík for being involved in this event, and he agreed. Then together, we asked each Nordic embassy for their participation. Regarding this, I would like to express my gratitude and greatest thanks to Mr. Ari Tassanen, the Deputy Head of Mission of Finland, for co-organizing this conference and helping us with the program. It's nearly unbelievable that all this took only a month. So thank you. And thank you, our audience, for coming in such great numbers. So it's my honor as chairperson to welcome here President of CEVRO Institute, Mr. Josef Šíma, giving his introductory speech. Mr. President, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It is a great honor to be the one who opens up the conference. I want to welcome you all here at CEVRO Institute, School of Legal and Social Studies. I'm very delighted we have such distinguished speakers and such distinguished audience. I look forward to the debates about the Nordic countries. There are so many topics to be debated, and indeed, we have to celebrate this publication, which appeared a few months ago as part of CEVRO Institute academic press. It is one of the products of what we can and want to do here to signal to the world that there is this small private college in the very heart of Prague, CEVRO Institute, which actually has many interesting things to offer. For those of you who are not familiar with the history of CEVRO Institute, the school is only 6 years old, so it's one of the youngest educational institutions in Prague. The goal, very ambitious goal, is to be a small, family-like, elite private college where you can study social sciences. The school started offering BA in political science and international relations and public law and public administration. We later added a BA on private law, law in business. And very recently, still unofficial information, we are starting to offer BA in economic policy next fall. So we covered the core social sciences, political science, law, economics, and want to offer very interesting cross-disciplinary programs and indeed research based on it. On top of our BA level, we have master's level programs in these sciences, and that would actually be the sort of complete package of CEVRO Institute for the coming years. I'm delighted that conferences of this quality and of this sort attract people who want to learn more about different parts of the world from different perspectives. I believe our students will greatly benefit from extracurricular activities such as this one, and I hope that our distinguished guest will come to other events in the future to our school, or possibly co-organize with us events that would somehow relate to individual problems or individual countries present here. So I wish all of you luck. I look forward very much to the conference, and I hope it is a new start of cooperating with people and institutions and embassies for the future. The school needs such conferences, and we will do our best to host it perfectly today and host similar events in the future as well. So, long live the conference.
Thank you, Mr. President, for opening our conference. Now it's my great pleasure to welcome Mr. Jens Eikaas, Ambassador of Norway, representing the Nordic Presidency 2012.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Nordic countries, I would like to thank our moderator, Sven Borak, for taking the initiative to today's seminar on the Nordic countries and European integration. I would also like to thank, again on behalf of the Nordic countries, the CEVRO Institute and President Šíma, and also Dr. Brunclík for their kind offer to host this event and to take part in arranging it. And also for their excellent cooperation in bringing the first idea of Mr. Borak into fruition and a focused and interesting program. Now, the Nordic countries are closely linked through history. If we go back for 1,000 years, the countries have alternated between cooperating, waging war with each other, and entering into alliances and conquering each other. But the first steps toward present-day Nordic cooperation were taken after World War II, and also in 1952, when the Nordic Council was formed. The Nordic Council of Ministers, which is an equivalent cooperation between the Nordic governments, was established in 1971. The guidelines for the Nordic Council and the Nordic Council of Ministers are laid down in the Helsinki Treaty, which was signed on the 23rd of March 1962. It entered into force on the 1st of July 1962. The 50th anniversary this spring of the Helsinki Treaty is testimony to one of the world's most extensive forms of regional collaboration. Nordic cooperation plays an important role in European and international collaboration. It has firm traditions in politics, in economy, and culture in all the Nordic countries. Nordic cooperation seeks to safeguard Nordic and regional interests and principles in the global community. Cooperation across borders and the removal of obstacles to freedom of movement are important aspects of Nordic cooperation. Common Nordic values help the region solidify its position as one of the world's most innovative and competitive. This year, Norway does, as was mentioned already here, hold the rotating presidency of the Nordic Council of Ministers. I wish to welcome also in this capacity. Norway has made the welfare state and its continued development in a Nordic perspective a priority for its presidency. The Norwegian presidency program aims to keep the Nordic region at the forefront of progress, especially in the area of green growth based on economic development with sustainable use of natural resources. Particular attention will be paid to closer interaction between education, research, and innovation in relation to green growth and sustainable health and welfare. I wish you all a good seminar.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And thirdly, I'd like to welcome Mr. Lukáš Vítek, giving us the information about young conservatives in the Czech Republic. Lukáš, the floor is yours.
Your Excellencies, the ambassadors, representatives of CEVRO Institute, guests invited, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, let me express our appreciation for the possibility of cooperating this seminar, and also let me introduce the civic organization of young conservatives in Czech Republic. We represent young people and students with conservative and liberal ideas such as democracy, responsibility of the individuals, good educational system, principles of free market, and many others. To spread these ideas, we make conferences, discussions with the politicians, summer and winter educational events, and participating international events around the world. In the international field, we are the members of Young European Conservatives, European Democrat Students, Democrat Youth Community of Europe, and International Democrat Union, where we share and exchange our ideas and attitudes. I was asked to make my speech short, so for more information, please find our leaflets and periodicals, Pravý úhel and blog, you got with the folders, and don't hesitate to talk to me during the event to find out a bit more about us. By the end, I would like to thank our honored guests, our main coordinator Sven Borak, because this wouldn't happen without him, and our sponsor Hans Siedel Foundation, and also to all of you for coming here today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Lukáš. So, Nordic countries and European integration, as I have said, is the key topic of today's conference. The conference is divided into two blocks. After each is a discussion, and after the whole meeting there is a reception on which you are kindly welcome. So, the first block is entitled Hesitant Europeans, Ambiguities of Nordic Countries' Attitudes and Actions in Regard to European Integration. This block deals with 7 subtopics that will be presented by our speakers. So please join me in welcoming from left to right Mr. Miloš Brunclík, Mr. Rikard Bengtsson, Mr. Lars Kjellberg, Mrs. Päivi Hiltunen-Toivio. I hope that after a short time we will be joined by Stefán Skjaldarson, Ambassador of Iceland. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Jens Eikaas and Mrs. Annika Jagander. As you heard, my name is Sven Borak, and as a chairperson, I declare the Block 1 open. So, now I'd like to introduce Mr. Miloš Brunclík, presenting Nordic countries and European integration from a historical perspective. So, Mr. Brunclík, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My task is to provide sort of a background for contributions and notes of other speakers here, and also to spark debate and reactions later today. My topic is called Nordic countries and European integration from a historical perspective. I will try to summarize Nordic countries' attitudes towards European integration over time. Of course, it's a very broad issue, so I will pick the most important events and moments, and also the moments I found very interesting. I will try to be short and precise.
The remote is off. You have to-
Sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah. I've tried to cover the period from 1950s when European Union was born and move until today, but very, very briefly, so there will be a lot of questions and issues open. My major argument is that there has been a strong gravitation effect of European Union, earlier European communities. Originally, Nordic countries were quite suspicious of European integration, but later they embraced the idea of European integration, and they later joined, most of the Nordic countries joined European Union. However, Nordic countries seem to be very, very pragmatic in their integration process, and they were all the time, as it seems, weighing economic benefits and political costs of the integration. Drawing inspiration from Toivio Milian, we can distinguish three types of Europeans. Nordic countries were traditionally regarded as reluctant Europeans, able and capable to join, but unwilling to join, meaning European integration, European communities, and later European Union. Besides that, there are so-called committed Europeans, as those meaning founding countries of European Union, France, Germany, Benelux country, and Italy. So, as I said, traditionally Nordic countries were portrayed as reluctant, being opposed to European integration. But this picture today seems far from perfect. First, we can mention that Denmark was least reluctant. It was the first country to join the European Union. And second, Finland. Finland is a special case. It can't be called reluctant in the same way as Sweden or Norway, for example. It was tied by a special relationship with the Soviet Union at the time. What I have in mind is especially the 1948 agreement of friendship, cooperation, and mutual assistance. And during the Cold War, I think we can't speak of independent Finnish foreign policy. So that's why Finland is a special case, and we can call it eager European, unable but still very eager and willing to join European integration. And I will try to analyze the development of these three types of Europeans later. The integration policy of Nordic countries depended on economic incentives or benefits on the one hand, and political costs of the integration or political constraints on the other hand. If you look at the 1950s, it's clear that none of the Nordic countries was involved in starting European integration, or better said, European communities. There were numerous constraints. It's not here a time to discuss it in detail, but most of them had to do with geopolitics, international politics. There were NATO members like Iceland or Norway, but also neutral countries, Finland and Sweden, but both had a different kind of neutrality. There was also welfare concerns, specific economic interests. Here just a note about a sort of Nordic difference, especially in Sweden, but elsewhere, to a certain extent too. European communities were portrayed as in a negative way, like a conservative, Catholic, capitalist, or colonial project. And this image, of course, includes a lot of stereotypes, but these stereotypes appeared in discussions about European integration. What changed was political and economic situation, especially in the 1960s. So in 1960s, important economic incentives emerged. Not only EFTA in the late 1950s was established, but also first application to common market were submitted. An important role in this process was played by Great Britain. It was a significant trade partner for most of Nordic countries. Despite French President de Gaulle's veto on British application and membership, which in fact meant a stop for membership of Nordic countries, despite this veto, the issue of European integration got on the agenda in Nordic countries. There were many arguments revolving around European integration, which have been repeatedly used since then, and most of them are still used, revolving around democracy, sovereignty, etc. Here I pick just one argument as described here at this poster from Denmark. We can see the poster of Danish People's Movement against EC, portraying European community and membership in European community as being incompatible with Nordic cooperation. We can see that the Danish swan being a symbol of Nordic cooperation, is breaking apart from the rest of Nordic countries. The issue of European integration got also on the agenda in national elections, even though it was not the decisive issue. This is the example from Sweden, from the 1962 elections. On the left, we can see the poster by the Conservative Party, traditional advocate of the Swedish membership in European communities and later European Union. On the right, much more careful poster by Centre Party. A real breakthrough came in 1970s. First, Denmark became the first Nordic country to become EC member. In the 1972, Danish people agreed to join. And second, despite the other countries stayed outside EC, by 1973 all Nordic countries, including Norway and Iceland, signed free trade agreement with the European community. So even the other countries which stayed outside became sort of integrated. Despite this breakthrough, significant sections of population, including, for example, People's Movement against EC, but also others, many important sections of population regarded EC membership as detrimental to Danish economy. This is another example. I think this poster is quite clear. It's a poster by the time Danish Communist Party portraying EC as a big black octopus being a threat for small Danish fish. Another important change, and I can say a fundamental change, came in the break of 1980s and 1990s. Cold War constraints I mentioned before were removed, and the way towards further European integration was opened. First, European Economic Area was established, including Sweden, Norway, and Iceland. But at the same time, EC or EU membership got on the agenda again for Norway and Sweden, and in fact for Finland for the first time. All the three countries submitted their applications, but Norway rejected the membership again in the 1994 referendum. So if we are to summarize to what extent Nordic countries are reluctant today, perhaps Norway seems to be the only reluctant country at the moment. As illustrated by this cartoon, we can see a Norwegian Viking plugging his ear and doesn't want to hear anything about European Union, anything from a European Union. Of course, another stereotype, Norway, despite being outside European Union, is closely cooperating with the European Union. Still, Norway sees a lot of important problems within the EU, some of them being mentioned here. It seems that economic benefits of the membership would be too little and political costs would be too high for Norway. Denmark is another interesting country. It seems that from, let's say, its accession to EC in 1973 until, let's say, end of Cold War, Denmark was a food-dragging country. As one Danish scholar observed, Danish left and right agree to do as little as possible, as late as possible, as cheaply as possible, and with as little enthusiasm as possible, related to Danish efforts within European communities. But a change came again, and now it seems that Denmark is much more active in European affairs, even though public might be much more skeptical about European integration than political elites. Again, one cartoon illustrating this, showing rejection of Maastricht Treaty in the first referendum about this important treaty. Denmark, for a short time, blocked the way to the approval of Maastricht Treaty in Europe. However, Maastricht Treaty was 1 year later approved in another referendum, but Denmark got 4 important exceptions called opt-outs, including currency, citizenship, foreign policy area, and justice and home affairs. But current government, maybe Mr. Kjellberg will correct me, is trying to abolish at least 2 of these opt-outs. If you look at Sweden, again, there's much to discuss. Here I just put 2 important statements by 2 important Swedish politicians, one being from Cecilia Malmström, the former Minister for EU Affairs, and the second one statement was written by Carl Bildt, the Swedish Minister of Foreign Affairs, and both agree that they try to be meaning Sweden tried to be in the center, in the core of European integration. So if you look at these statements, we can't say that Sweden is a reluctant. It seems that it's the opposite. Finland, very briefly, Finland became a very active in European Union. It, as the only country, adopted Euro. So from this point of view, Finland is the most integrated Nordic country as far as European integration is concerned. And again, Finland is very, very active in European integration process. One important information about Iceland, or several important sentences about Iceland. I didn't mention it so far. In Iceland, the issue of membership was traditionally out of agenda, despite the changes in the late 1980s and early 1990s. But the change came with the economic crisis in Iceland in 2008. The government was toppled, government was changed, and also the foreign policy was changed. And it seems to me that the change of the policy was dictated by economic concerns, economic crisis. So at the time, 3-4 years ago, European Union and Euro was regarded as a refuge for Iceland, as illustrated by this cartoon. At the moment, negotiation about accession to the EU are taking place, but the final say will rest in the hands of the people, of the Icelandic citizens. despite the overall very pro-European trend in Nordic countries, there are so-called Eurosceptical political forces and parties which oppose Nordic countries' membership. Some of them demand Nordic countries' withdrawal from the EU, and most of them got mandates in national parliaments elections and also in European Parliament elections. So we might speculate about Euro cleavage. And final, my conclusion, again, very briefly, perhaps with the exception of Norway, Nordic countries are no longer reluctant countries or no longer reluctant Europeans. There is close cooperation, including Norway and Iceland, the non-EU members who closely cooperate with European integration. And it seems that European Union has become too big to be ignored, and it has a strong power to attract Nordic countries. So I hope that my contribution, my note, would spark the debate and your reaction, and I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your remarkable presentation, Mr. Brunclík. And I'd like you to know, the audience, that after the whole block, there will be a time for your questions and comments. So write down your notes and do not hesitate to ask during the discussion part. Next keynote is entitled Nordic Countries and the EU from Hesitancy and Opt-out into Influence and Making a Difference, presented by Mr. Rikard Bengtsson. Mr. Bengtsson, please. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Happy to see so many of you interested in Nordic affairs. That's a good sign, I think. My task here today is to speak about contemporary times and a little bit looking into the future, which is a difficult task and something that is a bit uncomfortable, I guess, given the poor track record also of us political scientists. But trying to look at the Nordic as a group, problematizing that a little bit, and see if there is some kind of untapped potential in relation to the European Union. So the title here is From Hesitancy and Opt-outs into Influence and Making a Difference. And I think it fills nicely, or fits nicely into where Miloš left off. Now we have the good background of how the countries of the Nordic region have related to the European Union and its predecessors. And now we can take a somewhat closer look at interacting in and with the EU and EU institutions. And to begin with, and this then is my first slide, and it will be basically the same kind of reasoning that we just heard. My point of departure is, on the one hand, that there are a number of Nordic commonalities. Similarities and commonalities among the Nordic countries. And we can see that both, I would argue, in relation to European affairs and more generally in relation to global affairs or international political matters. I would summarize that as a sort of internationalist orientation on the part of the Nordic countries. It's a shared belief, maybe stemming from the fact that we're all dealing now with small countries in the European periphery, if you like. So there is a need to cooperate, but a belief in international cooperation, international organization, one could say. And there has developed, and there is something, I would argue, of a common Nordic value base. But as you can see, I put a question mark there, and it is a good question for debate, actually. What are the common elements of that Nordic value base? And are they only Nordic, one could ask? Or are they rather part of something larger, something European? And to what extent are they commonly shared by the Nordic people? Is another question in that context. But that's one side of the story, the commonalities in internationalist orientation. At the same time, we witnessed, and we heard a very nice account of this, that in European matters, the Nordic countries relate to European institutions and to European cooperation in different ways. We have seen it in the past in terms of how the membership of the EU, EC and the EU, has been approached. And we can frame it, if we now take political science jargon, in terms of how to strike the balance between intergovernmental cooperation, which is the standard way of doing things, and supranational cooperation, which is the EC, EU way of doing things, partly at least. And in the Nordic context, there is a number of variations in how to approach the EU. One very obvious point, of course, is the one between being on the inside and remaining on the outside. Some countries have opted for membership, others have chosen to stay outside, and instead develop a very close functional cooperation in the form of the so-called European Economic Area Agreement, which in essence means that in many sectors of cooperation, in this context now, Norway and Iceland are very close to the EU countries in various cooperative matters. But there is also something about variation in terms of membership profile. Looking at the 3 EU members now, Denmark, Sweden and Finland, it is fair to say that they have had very different approaches to their EU membership. And they have now, I would say, very different approaches to their EU membership. What is interesting is the change over time. Also in a very short time period, a span of a few years, we can see interesting changes on the account of Sweden, on the account of Finland, and I would say also on the account of Denmark. I'll come back to that in various ways here in my presentation. One factor that fits into this picture is changes in the domestic politics of these countries, as we have also pointed to before. And I'm thinking here particularly of the growing importance of Eurosceptical parties, but one could also turn it around and say the approach of the governments in relation to major EU events and processes, such as the council presidencies that these countries have had in recent years. For Sweden, for instance, it's quite obvious that the reorientation, more active posture on the part of the Swedish government prior to the first council presidency in 2001 remains an important turning point in Sweden's EU policy. And after that, it has been much more of an active European country. And that is also to be seen in the opinion of the Swedish people, which was, although there was a yes vote in the referendum in the fall of 1994, the public opinion in Sweden was quite negative for a long time, but changed in 2001 and has since that remained positive and is now, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 65% of the people positive to the EU membership, and the remaining people roughly negative or undecided in equal portions. We see these domestic politics changes also in Denmark, in the sense that repeatedly governments have said that Denmark should take on a more, you could call it pro-European approach, although I think that is not as simple as that. But in the Danish case, it would mean that the opt-outs from the Maastricht Treaty should be up for a referendum to see whether the Danish people wants to keep them or not. And if I understand the current government correctly, it is now a question of the opt-outs regarding defense and judicial matters, not the opt-out regarding the euro. And in the Finnish case, on the other hand, my impression, maybe we have a dramatically different interpretation here, but my impression is that the Finnish enthusiasm of the early years of the Finnish membership have somewhat faded away, and the activism is not as obvious. My impression is that Finland for a long time stood out as the good European in the circle of Nordic EU members, and now it may be a more leveled playing field among the three. So this is where we stand in terms of the Nordic countries. But there is, of course, something more important and interesting to address, and that is the fact, so to say, that the context in which the Nordic countries approach the EU is changing. So I put a few points on the board here regarding that changing context. Let's see if I can get my papers in order here. Some rather new issues that need to be addressed and that may change the logic of how Nordic EU members and non-EU members approach European cooperation. One issue, very general, very abstract in a sense, is the question of managing globalization. It's an evident issue in these years, in these times, but it may mean very different things. But I would expect generally a pressure in the direction of more cooperation against the background of advanced forms of interdependence, which is the fact both in the Nordic circle and in the European context. So that's one dimension to bring into this. Also important here is that the EU, I would argue, is in a, you could call it the perfect storm if you like, a set of multiple crises. Political crisis, economic crisis, maybe identity crisis of some sort. And that may sound problematic and negative, and it is in many ways. But it may also mean that the Nordic approach to the EU may take on new forms, new roles for the Nordic countries, both inside and in the immediate neighborhood, so to say, of the EU. I'm thinking here that there may be windows of opportunity for addressing issues in a way that they have not been addressed before, and therefore a potential for leadership or potential for agenda setting at least, if the Nordic countries jointly would like to make some kind of further imprint. Maybe the Nordic countries can do that individually, but it seems to me quite difficult. The key to all of this is cooperation. Also in this picture, about the changing context, is that the EU is nowadays in a permanent situation of differentiated integration. It is no longer, if it ever were, the case that all countries in the EU have the same kind of membership. Now, different countries are members on different terms. The Danish opt-outs are good illustrations of that. The workings of the Schengen area is another good illustration of that. The euro in itself is, of course, the best illustration in a sense. And I would be very surprised if that is not where the EU is going also in the future. And if so, it means that the variations that we have seen in the past in terms of membership profiles is something natural and something to be expected. And it will be less than of a core EU and a peripheral EU, but much more individual approaches and profiles. Maybe that is something for the Nordic countries also to take into the picture. And it seems of relevance in this context that the distinction between formal membership or not is, it's already quite complex given the close association of many countries, but it seems that that difference will be even less important. I could have added a point here also about the potential, which is now in the treaty, for enhanced cooperation, of moving forward in a differentiated way, not with the full EU circle, but with those who would like to. And there is an invitation in a positive direction, so to say, for countries to approach the EU in different ways. So the differentiation is a possibility for designing the membership the way countries want to some extent. I shouldn't overemphasize that. But it also means possibilities for the Nordic countries to put a Nordic profile on issues in situations where it may not be possible, so to say, to get an EU-wide solution on a certain topic. And as partly an illustration of that, we can see that in the sub-regional context, we find examples of this. If we move to the Baltic Sea area, for instance, the very existence of a Baltic Sea strategy in the EU is, you could argue, a sign of or an example of differentiated integration. It's a mechanism for doing something in one part of the EU while not doing that in other parts of the EU. At least not at the same time, because there seem to be now macro-regional strategies developing in other places, the Danube region, for instance. But it also means, and this is quite interesting, that there is a new role for Nordic institutions. The Nordic Council of Ministers, other Nordic institutions, other Baltic Sea institutions. It means that we still have a multi-layered system of cooperation in Europe. But it also means, if you allow, a vertical division of labor among different actors on different levels. I think this context generally is conducive to Nordic cooperation. But at the same time, we know, on the one hand, that the Nordics have had a hard time in the EU cooperating. And we see signs, I would say, also in global politics and in sub-regional politics of the Nordic countries not going in the same direction all the time. So maybe the conclusion of this part will have to be a sort of untapped potential. It's not a fact today, but there may be openings for further Nordic advances in the future. And on that point, I turn to my next slide here, which I've called a Nordic way, question mark. And the title here is inspired by a number of publications, as it is. It's an attractive title, obviously. But for instance, one that has been quite important at the World Economic Forum in Davos, that some of you may have noticed, where the topic of Nordic cooperation and the Nordic model has attracted quite some attention. And in that economic focus, what is fascinating about the Nordic way, if there is one, is the combination of a very competitive economic environment, generally speaking, and some kind of welfare system or welfare model. Gender equality and sustainable development may also be part of that, but I think it's easiest to see in terms of somewhat of a tension between economic competitiveness and social welfare. And it seems, at least this is the argument of some economists, that this may be combined in the Nordic context. There is also something, if you look into, for instance, the Eurobarometer inquiries that we have every 6 months, there is something about how the Nordic countries, and people in the Nordic countries rather, approach their political institutions. The level of trust in domestic political institutions is much higher in the Nordic countries than most other parts of Europe, where the trust in EU institutions is higher than in domestic political institutions. That is not the case in the Nordic. So there is somewhat of a belief in the government, or in the political system at least, in these countries. And then we get to the question, can there then be, is there perhaps more of a Nordic approach to the EU and in the EU? If I argue that there is some kind of potential, I think the follow-on question is, okay, how do you get there, so to say? And one thing that I personally see lacking in much of Nordic EU rhetoric, so to say, is the explicit expressions of Nordic common interests, and even more important, I think, common visions. Solving European problems in a Nordic or northern way. Perhaps arguing along the lines of the first point, that there is something here that could be of interest to others. Also, something that you would expect is much more elaborate than is actually the case, or the fact, is institutionalized Nordic policy coordination. These 2 points go together partly. The Nordic countries coordinate in front of major EU decisions, but there is no automatic day-to-day coordinating reflex the way that I and many others would expect. It seems to be a quite easy way to do things in a more Nordic way. If now, in the end, the ambition is to have a Nordic approach to the EU. And the third point here is about how to get some power in the EU system, which is there is no standard formula for that, but one general observation is that it seems to be more difficult for small countries in the EU today with the Lisbon Treaty than before. For one thing, the rotating presidency, which has played an important role for small countries, is fading away. We have permanent presidencies now in a number of contexts, the European Council being the most important one. So finding common strategies and mutually supporting strategies for influencing EU power centers could be the European Parliament, could be major governments of the EU, for that matter. And as an illustration of my thinking, I point here in the end to the so-called Northern Future Forum that maybe some of you have heard of, which is an unofficial, you could call it, or informal, perhaps better, discussion club among the Nordic countries, the Baltic countries, and the United Kingdom. And it has been around for a couple of years, and the argument is that these countries have some kind of common approach to long-term important topics on the European agenda. So trying to steer away from short-term crisis management to long-term issues about, for instance, gender equality, about economic growth, sustainable development, and so on. I think this Northern Future Forum is interesting in the sense that it is not influencing the EU in a formal way. It is perhaps influencing the agenda in terms of ideas. And maybe that is where the Nordic countries and also others may make a difference, to work with ideas and concepts and understandings and meanings, so to say, rather than relying on formal power mechanisms. It will be interesting to follow this and see where it ends up. So far, as I said, it's quite informal and is not directed at specific points on the EU agenda, but rather taking a much broader vision. Finally, I ask myself here, this all sounds good. and promising, but there are challenges ahead. And they are partly about the Nordic countries, actually, and partly about the EU. One thing, a reflection that I have, is that the Nordic community, if you like, is playing more the role of an arena than an actor. It's a place where the Nordic countries meet rather than an entity through which they channel their interests and visions. So moving from being an arena to becoming an actor is a question of political will. And there I sense that not all Nordic governments are going in the same direction at the same time. There are elements of intra-Nordic competition that we cannot steer away from, although there may be more fundamental, more overarching common values and common interests. And then I realized that I somehow twisted the words there in my second subpoint. Securing, I guess it should be, Nordic commitment. And that is a commitment to the idea of Norden, or the Nordics, in the EU, rather than going it alone. There have been tendencies in the past, also for the Nordic countries, of going it alone. I can see that in the policy of Finland. I can certainly see it in the policy of Sweden. And maybe one could also say that, in a general sense, this is also a Danish thing, so to say. Not isolated to the EU then, but also involving NATO. So the commitment is the crucial thing. But on the other hand, maybe that is necessary. It may not be sufficient, because there are also European-level developments that play an important role here. And one is the crisis management mode that we are in still, and that I expect will be there for some time to come. Now, the outcome of that is could be, at least I should say, either paralysis or supranationalism. Meaning then that the way out is to advance integration. And that is what I think are signs of the six-pack, for instance, in the economic realm. And neither of those two are especially conducive to Nordic cooperation, or the Nordic approach to the EU. Because after all, although the Nordics are not as reluctant as in the past, I would still argue that it's not a very enthusiastic crowd in terms of supranational solutions. Then we also have the question of the institutional setup of the EU, which is, as I said before, is making things more difficult. And there is both the point that the major countries in the EU are playing perhaps an even more important role now, and also that it seems to be, in a sense, less political and more bureaucratic. The EU, if we take the Commission especially, is more administrative in how it now approaches certain issues, economics again being a good case here. And then you must ask a question all along. If the Nordic countries put some kind of profile on the table, how legitimate is that in the eyes of the others? There are a number of other countries in the EU, of course, but also groups of countries with their own agendas. So finding that formula of a sort of Nordic profile within all European context is the challenge for the future. And final point here is that I think we cannot discuss European developments without looking at the global dynamics. And there is a sort of general trend to multilateralism light, you could call it. The weaker forms of multilateral organization and regulation. And that is not what the Nordic countries have stood for in the past. And they are not proposing this, but maybe there is not much that they can in the end do about it, but simply have to adapt to it. And that will, of course, create difficulties for getting a sort of Nordic touch or Nordic profile on the major issues on the global level as well. Okay, thank you for listening. I'll stop here.
And I thank you, Mr. Bengtsson, for your valuable presentation. It was very nice, and I think we can more discuss later in the discussion block, like visions, values, and these things. So now I'd like to introduce Mr. Lars Kjellberg, giving his presentation on Danish presidency in European communities and European Union.
Can you see anything? Is it okay, the colors? Okay, yeah, thank you. Ambassadors, colleagues, and I think I can say friends. First of all, I have to apologize on behalf of my ambassador that he couldn't make it today because he's out of country. So it's, so to say, up to me to represent Denmark. And as Sven just mentioned, I have been asked to say a few words about the Danish EU policy and our presidencies during the years. As Miloš mentioned in his introduction, it's, I think, important to have a little bit of a look at the history to see the changes in the Danish policy as well as the EU policy and how it goes. So, as we all know, we became member in 1973. We entered the EU together with the UK and Ireland. And we have hoped, of course, that Norway would enter at the same time, but they didn't. And we were not disappointed, but yeah, we need to find another word. We were sad about that. So, and within these 40 years of membership, we have had the presidency now 7 times. We are the EU president at the moment. And it's not that easy always to be the president. As we heard, we have some difficulties in our membership. We have the opt-outs. One can say that in 1972 we voted yes. In 1992 we voted no to the Maastricht Treaty. And we got these 4 opt-outs so that we could continue our membership of the EU. I'll come back to these opt-outs, or at least some of them, a little later. And if we look at our presidencies, the first, it was actually only half a year after we entered the EU that we became president of the EU. And all the countries down in Europe, they looked to Denmark and thought, would this small, tiny country be able of running a presidency? I think we did it quite well, and I think we have also done the other presidencies quite well. If we have to put a few headlines on our presidencies, I think we could say it's about crisis management and it's about enlargement. Crisis management back in the 70s, we had the oil crisis, and there was economic crisis. It was also the same in the beginning of the 80s. And in the, maybe in 87, there was a little bit of change. One could say there we have a headline calling for this multi-annual budget that was on the agenda during that half year, and the introduction of the Single European Act, a new step for the EU as well. One can also say, as on the crisis that we have at the moment in the EU is not an easy one. It's not an easy one for Denmark because we are not a member of the Eurozone. So we have to sit outside the door when they discuss inside the 17 countries. They discuss inside what should happen with the EU in the future. And the president can't be part of that. That's a little bit frustrating. When we talk about enlargements, that is, I think, the most positive thing that the Danes have been doing as president for the EU. And it goes step by step from back in 82, where there was a discussion and there was an agreement on further enlargement of the EU, and Spain and Ireland became member. Later on, in 93, there was 2 other Nordic countries that was on the table at that time, and we had, and they became member, as you know, in 95. And then the big enlargement after the 2002, where all the Baltic countries and the Visegrad countries and Slovenia and Malta and Cyprus became members, and later on Romania and Bulgaria. So now we are, is it 27 or something? It's almost impossible to count nowadays. That's the reason why we call it from Copenhagen to Copenhagen, because in 93 we created the Copenhagen criteria for enlargement, and that is, so to say, what happened in 2002. What is going to happen during this half year is then something else. We have put out 4 priorities. We had hoped that we could be more productive, but because of this crisis management again, as we are a little late in coming up with the positive, or at least I think we have managed the crisis quite well, but we would have liked to move a little more on these 4 priority areas, as you will see now. Of course, on the responsible Europe, it's, of course, before, so to say, when we planned for our presidency, we saw the multi-annual financial framework as the most important thing during this presidency. But because of the crisis, it's, we would have liked to finish almost the paperwork on this issue. But I'm not sure that we're going to do that, because we are a little late. And on one of the others, a dynamic Europe, that is, I think, also part of what we could call the Nordic way. It's important for the Nordic countries to have a single market, and that goes as it is. And then we have the flagship, the Danish flagship, and I think we can call it a Nordic flagship as well. But in these times, as a difficult times, it's when the crisis is still here and so on, it's a little difficult for us to persuade countries, as we say, down in Europe, that it's a good idea to invest in the future in regard to come with new inventions on green economy. But I think that is where, for example, the Nordic countries, if we stick together, that we can push something forward. And it also goes to, we come with a strong mandate to the Rio +20 conference later this year. Then we have a safe Europe. It's, of course, on the immigration and migration and the refugee issues that is important here. It's almost on the headlines in the Danish press every day, on the refugee issue and the migration issue. And if we look a little bit further on and into the future, this is what I found in the current government's program about what we would like to aim at in the coming years. And as Miloš and Rikard said, we are trying to see if we could abolish some of the opt-outs, We are talking about the green thing again. We're talking about the social Europe. We are talking about a common foreign policy. It's important for us. This with a bit of financial, better regulation of financial sector, and so on and so on. And I hope that we can succeed in the future to come up with measures on these points. If it is looked at as a country that is reluctant when we're talking about the EU, I don't know. But I think that most of the points fits quite well into what Rikard just mentioned as the Nordic way of doing things when we're talking about the social aspect as well as the green and the free market. So yes, that was my contribution. I hope that you got a little bit of information that you didn't know about before, and I would just like to say thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Kjellberg. Now I'd like to introduce Mrs. Päivi Hiltunen-Toivio, presenting Finland, the only Nordic in Europe.
Thank you, dear colleagues and dear students. First of all, thank you for inviting me and organizing this seminar today. Oh. Can you hear now? I'm short, okay. So, in Finland, we used to say that we have always been part of Europe. We have had good relations with all European countries and especially close cooperation with other Nordic states. Our integration to Europe started long before we joined the European Union in 1995. It was already 50 years ago when we made an agreement with the European Free Trade Association in 1961 and became later a full member of it in 1986. We negotiated a free trade agreement with then EEC in 1973 and the EEA agreement in early 1990s. The debate about EU membership in Finland really started at the beginning of 1990s, at the end of the Cold War. The discussions were further accelerated when Sweden made clear its intention to apply membership. By joining the EU, we wanted to strengthen our economic growth, development and stability. We had fresh memories of the deep economic recession in early 1990s. We also believed that the EU would increase the security of the country by giving us a place in the European family. In the referendum, 57% of citizens supported our EU membership. The accession to the European Union was the most important event in Finland's recent history. Membership of the EU became a cornerstone of Finland's identity. The European integration has been seen as a process in which a small country should definitely participate in. Finland has used conciliatory and constructive behavior as a common method for gaining influence, promoting its interests and getting support. This method has proven to be successful. For Finland, European cooperation has always been a choice based on common values and principles. We find this cooperation still today as a means of reviving troubled national economies, as well as finding answers to challenges such as population aging, international competition and climate change. We think that the answer to these challenges lies in improving Europe's ability to function. According to latest studies, Finns' attitudes towards EU membership are today even more positive. The EU is widely seen playing a crucial role in the continent's development. The majority thinks that the Union's regulation is excessive, but this is not seen as a threat to Finnish culture. The EU is also seen as a bureaucratic community suffering from democratic gap, where the big states, member states dictate the terms. Nevertheless, the EU is regarded as having succeeded fairly well. The EU is believed to safeguard peace and promote economic prosperity. The economy is deemed, however, to gain too much attention in the Union. Finland was a founding member of the Economic and Monetary Union and amongst the first to join the euro. For Finland, membership of the European Union and the EMU has been a beneficial choice. As a member, Finland is more prosperous and secure than it would be as a non-member. For a small country, it would be much harder to succeed alone. The euro is seen as having served its function well. The majority of Finns have a positive attitude towards the euro, while relatively few long for the Finnish markka. EMU membership is seen as a prudent bet that has turned out well, and the euro is currently considered to entail more advantages than disadvantages. Also, Finland's firm policy on handling the euro crisis gains the support of its citizens. Today, Finland is a net payer to EU. In 2010, Finland paid to EU 300 million euros, which was 57 euros per citizen. Finland gets money from the EU mainly in the form of agricultural subsidies. Finland's interest to maintain northern agriculture and receive structural funding for our peripheral regions in the north and east have been one of the most important questions for us since the membership negotiations. During our 17 years membership, Finland has had 2 successful EU presidencies. Our aim has been to be an active and constructive member. A strong point in Finland's EU policy has been its coherence based on a well-functioning EU coordination system. The basic policy has remained the same through different governments. Our priorities in EU are internal market enlargement, neighbourhood policies, environment, energy safety and human rights, to great extent similar to the priorities of the Czech Republic. The strength and efficiency of the EU are the basic goals of Finland's EU policy. Most important is to maintain and strengthen the operational capacity of the Union. This was also the aim of the Lisbon Treaty, which was ratified in Finland with a broad political consensus. We support EU's role as a strong global player and its new External Action Service. According to Finland, strong and steady external representation by the EU is an advantage. EU's unity should also be visible in the sense that the EU speaks with one voice in external relations. That is the only way to draw real global attention. Finland cannot rely on its size for influence in international affairs, but we can do so by managing our own issues in such a way that Finland becomes an asset to the EU. This can be achieved by participating in common concerns in a constructive and professional manner and by establishing well-functioning personal relations with our colleagues in other member states and in EU institutions. Recently, the economy has dominated the European agenda, and the greatest challenge is the settlement of the Eurozone crisis. EU has partly managed to answer to this challenge by deciding on new rules. Next step will be to take care of their implementation. There is a saying that EU develops only through crisis. In this case, we really hope that the history repeats itself, that the Union emerges from the current crisis with a new and stronger value-based direction. The crisis we are now experiencing gives us the momentum to do what is necessary to shape the Union. In Finland, we still believe in EU and Euro. Hardly anyone thinks that the EU will break up or that the Euro will disappear. Critical comments to the government's EU policy and its commitments to various bailing out arrangements were mainly heard during the general elections last spring. Although the vote was taken, the course was kept. There is much more that the EU can do. Open global trade is crucial to Finland, since almost half of our GDP is export-based. For us, the keywords for the future are growth, jobs and prosperity. The competition of the single market is in everybody's interest, and it should be an absolute priority in the EU. In the single market, some areas have huge potential. Especially promising is the digital market. Here, progress should be made without delay to ensure EU's competitiveness against other global players. And finally, in the future, Finland wants to see a European Union which is effective, responsible and fair. A union where it pays to work, innovate and manufacture products. A Europe where it pays for enterprises to invest and hire employees. And Finland wants to continue to be in the forefront that determines the direction of the EU's development. Thank you.
Kiitos paljon. And thank you for your presentation, Your Excellency. From reluctant European into a team player, Swedish perspectives on the EU. That is the next presentation by Mrs. Annika Jagander.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I think I could sum up our policy by saying, well, Finland just said what our policy is. I'd like to give you the story, take it back a little bit, and tell you the story of how we became membership, the real story behind the story, so to speak. Because it tells, and I believe there are some students in the audience, it tells something about the fine art of political manipulation, if you wish. It tells the story of what a politician should do if he wants to change the course of policy without creating too much of a difficult debate. And the main protagonist in this story is the former Prime Minister at the time, Ingvar Carlsson. I'll get back to him. You have heard, of course, now that the attitude towards Europe in Sweden has traditionally, historically, been very much attached to what party you have belonged to, what political bloc, the left or the right. And you must then also remember that Sweden, for many years, the crucial years of the development of Sweden as a modern country, a modern state in the 20th century, the politicians at power were Social Democrats, the Social Democratic Party. For example, right after the Second World War, we had a foreign affairs minister, Östen Undén, who served as Minister for Foreign Affairs for 17 years. So, of course, he became very influential. And right throughout these many years, we had a very fundamental premise of our foreign policy. It has already been mentioned and referred to here. It was expressed as follows: non-alignment in peace, aiming at neutrality in wartime. This fundamental principle became almost a sacred principle, especially during this foreign minister that I just mentioned. Of course, there was an element of smugness, if you like, self-righteousness in this attitude. Sweden had, after all, been the country that had stayed out of war the longest of all the European countries. We had not been in war since, the Napoleonic era. And our self-image was that, well, that has been a fairly clever policy. We have become a fairly progressive welfare state. We have had good economic growth, better than many countries, and this is partly because of this policy. And of course, the Social Democrats were at the helm for these many years. So, of course, there was some reason for them to look at with skepticism at the Conservatives and the Christian Democrats ruling many other countries in Europe at the time. And of course, on the other hand, it's also logical to realize that the Conservatives in Sweden, the Moderate Party, as they later renamed themselves, the so-called People's Party, the Liberal Party, that they were much more positive to European cooperation already from the start. As has already been mentioned, we have had different phases in our relationship, although we have stayed outside of the European Union. We had different relationships. Of course, we were members of EFTA. We had trade agreements later on also with the European Economic Area. But there remained little doubt during all these years that as long as the Social Democrats were in power, that we should not join the community. And this was emphasized time and time again. You may remember Olof Palme, the prime minister who was murdered in 1986. He may personally have actually been in favor of joining, but his party was dead against, and so he was also officially against. He disappeared from the scene in a very tragic way and very quickly. He had an unwilling successor, Mr. Ingvar Carlsson, that I just mentioned in the beginning. He came to power to succeed Olof Palme in this tragic circumstance, and at the same time, the world started changing. The Berlin Wall fell, the Cold War ended, and it seemed that it wasn't real warfare that was now the threat anymore to the welfare state. It was really undisciplined economic and fiscal policy, to many populist policies that have made inflation skyrocket and so forth. And so Carlsson saw that there was a need for closer cooperation among governments to preserve the values of the welfare state. And he started having confidential consultations among other leaders in Europe. And they started to have create this shared view that more international cooperation was necessary in order to sort of counterbalance the growing importance of international capital as they saw it. Now this is interesting. Of course, this new way of seeing things was quite sensitive in Sweden domestically, because we had this policy on neutrality, and it was not, it was a sacred principle. It was a basic instinct. But Carlsson also saw the risk that the moderates, the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, they both announced in 1990 that they would make the issue of Sweden's full membership into the community a big issue in the following year's election. So what did Ingvar Carlsson do, learning this? He sent up a trial balloon. That's what politicians do. This balloon had the form of an article in one of Sweden's major newspapers, where he carefully hinted that a change might be considered. But this balloon didn't really work because it was so carefully worded that people actually understood it to mean the exact opposite, that the course shouldn't change, only that it could change if the reasons for the policy of neutrality in themselves were removed. But the article concluded by saying, and this is not the situation today. So that trial balloon actually failed. And he was met, never the same, with a lot of criticism. But he didn't give up. He wrote more articles, increasingly stressing that neutrality was indeed today's policy, but again, that changes could happen in the future. And he attacked his political opponents on the conservative field for wanting to bring Sweden into the European community already by the next century, or by the turn of the century. But it soon became clear for us in Sweden who followed this political game that Ingvar Carlsson was actually prepared to follow exactly the same quick schedule that he criticized his opponents for. At the same time, temperatures rose, domestically speaking. There was a party congress in 1990 where the Social Democrats said, well, they welcomed the changes in the global arena, but still membership was ruled out. Merely a hypothetical, theoretical hypothesis. And it was stated even in the early 90s, time and time again, that the talks that we were carrying on with the community were not supposed to lead to membership. There were other influential players, of course. The foreign minister at the time was dead against membership. The trade minister at the time was dead against membership and declared very openly how they felt about it. In a twist of irony, I might add that the Minister of Trade, she later became our first commissioner to the EU. That's how you handle these sort of things. So what Carlsson did, he struck up an alliance with another minister in his government that saw things the way he did, and that was the finance minister. He sidetracked the foreign minister and struck up an alliance with the finance minister. And happily, in a way, in September-October 1990, the global recession at the time started to impact on Sweden, and the economic situation of the country quickly turned worse, which was very helpful in this particular situation for what Carlsson had in mind. The application for membership could now be presented not just like something economically wise, but actually as an economic necessity. And Carlsson presented a package of budget cuts, 20 pages long. By the way, the foreign ministry was struck by severe budget cuts in that package, making the foreign minister so busy in his own ministry that he was sort of sidetracked and couldn't participate in the debate about the European Community membership very actively. This story is actually so interesting. It's almost like detective fiction, I think. In order to win over his opponents at this particular juncture, Carlsson utilized a very common political strategy called, I think political scientists call it the strategy of framing. You redefine the issue. And this redefinition aimed at describing the EU membership as an economic issue, not a political one. There was one sentence in that budget package that said the following, one sentence among 20 pages. The government desires a new decision by Parliament which in a clearer and more positive language expresses Sweden's ambition to become a member of the European Community. That was it. Everyone was taken by surprise. How could our century-old policy be overturned like that, which in hindsight has been described as a footnote? Of course, the foreign minister was upset. He was very upset, but he, externally, he kept very loyal, and he muttered something to the effect, well, you have to consider changing circumstances. And the trade minister, who was so dead against, she was outside of the country at the time. And when she returned, this had already happened. The Reform Communists, the left party, was really, they were very upset. They called the whole issue a scandal. But otherwise, people seemed to be very happy all of a sudden. In Parliament, there was now all of a sudden an overwhelming majority for seeking membership and for turning in the application. And the right bloc welcomed the Social Democrats into their old pro-European fold, so to speak. And the political atmosphere was, for a few weeks, at least in Parliament, very warm and happy and full of hugs and kisses. It didn't last so long, but it was nice at the time. The rest is history, and you've heard a lot about it already. An application was handed in. The negotiations took a couple of years. Parliament deliberated everything from whether the Swedes could keep this rather disgusting habit of using tobacco snuff, to whether we could still shoot snow grouse, I think it's called, this little bird, whether we could still keep our sugar beet industry growing, you know, very big political issues like that. And finally, there was a referendum, and the Swedish people said, yes, as you have learned, with a very narrow majority, but even so, that was respected. And about 7 weeks later, whoops, we joined the Union, together with Finland and Austria. And of course, as has already been indicated, the fact that we joined together with Finland has been very important for us. There have been times when we've been able to launch initiatives and together, I think, redirect the course in some areas of the European Union. For example, in the area of peacekeeping issues. And I think we have learned since 1995 to work and live within the Union. Our membership is not questioned. Public opinion is increasingly positive, although relatively skeptical. Only the left party really thinks still that we should leave the Union, although we have other Eurosceptical parties, one of which has been mentioned already, which I don't want to mention. We had another referendum, of course, in 2003, and unlike Finland, we chose to stay, or the people chose to vote no to the Eurozone. But even so, we do share the same feeling that we want to be and are part of the core of Europe. And in many ways, we share policies and viewpoints that are also, I think, true of the Czech Republic. Values such as integration, further integration, growth, liberalization of markets. We are as export-oriented and dependent as the Czech Republic is. We are, of course, in favor of lower trade barriers, a reformed long-term budget. We think the common agricultural policy must be reformed and made much more efficient. And of course, seeing the European Union as a peacekeeping project is important for us. We want to work within the European Union to build a safer and more secure world. I think from a legalistic point of view, we're probably viewed as one of those countries that are very diligent in implementing EU laws of all sorts. And of course, we will try to continue working, as has already been very well put here by my colleagues, for a functioning, democratic, sustainable, and prosperous Europe. That's the story behind the story. Thank you.
Tack så mycket. And thank you for your outstanding performance, Your Excellency. Now I'd like to introduce Mr. Jens Eikaas, presenting Norway both inside and outside.
Yes, I will spend most of my time talking about a report that was presented in January this year. It was commissioned by the Norwegian government, and it concerns Norway's relations with the EU. It's a fairly big report. It's 900 pages, and it covers all aspects of Norway's relations with the EU, including the Schengen Agreement and other cooperation and association agreements and arrangements between Norway and the European Union. Now this report is subtitled Outside and Inside, which is the title of my presentation. And that is because Norway can be said to be both outside the EU and in it at the same time, or Perhaps more precisely, it could be said that Norway is neither completely outside nor completely inside the EU. In principle, we have a difficult arrangement with the EU, with inherent structural tensions and problems. However, in practice, this form of association has worked fairly well and better than many expected. Experience so far is that the problems with the EEA, the Schengen and other agreements are greater in principle than they are in practice. The EEA agreement is, of course, the cornerstone in Norway's relations with the EU, and it has been for the last 20 years. With the EEA agreement, Norway became linked to the European integration process in a new way. The EEA agreement is efficient, it's innovative, and it gives a predictable framework and a level playing field for business, economic operators, and citizens. And through it, Norway has become increasingly closely linked with the EU. Although Norway is not a member of the EU, we are affected both directly and indirectly by developments in Europe. The level of stability and welfare in our neighboring countries, in European countries, has considerable influence on Norwegian politics. It also influences our economy and our social development. Norway's relations with the EU involves almost all sectors of society. Under Norway's agreements with the EU, Norway has incorporated approximately 3/4 of all EU legislative acts into Norwegian legislation, and it has implemented them more effectively than many of the EU countries. So, it has somewhat jokingly been said in Norway that we are among the most integrated countries in the Union. But our association with the EU has an unusual form. Normally, states become members of an international organization and they adapt according to that. Norway's relationship with the EU is based on association without membership. In an international context, Norway shares this form of cooperation with only 2 other countries, Iceland and Liechtenstein. So what I say about the institutional setup basically goes also for Iceland and Liechtenstein. According to this report, the agreements with the EU have, on the whole, safeguarded Norwegian interests and values. A broad majority at the Storting, the Norwegian Parliament, has been of the view that the EEA, Schengen and other agreements have safeguarded Norway's values and interests in a number of policy areas, including justice and home affairs, and foreign security and defense policy. But of course, the EEA agreement has had the probably biggest significance for the business sector and for working life in Norway. It has played a big and important part in the general modernization of Norway's economy and employment and working conditions. The report notes that during the past 20 years there have been some tensions and conflicts between EU and EEA rules on the one side and Norwegian traditions and rules on the other. And this has been challenging in some areas. However, given the large number of adaptations that have had to be made under the agreements, there have been relatively few conflicts. And many of them were resolved in a way that made it possible to continue to pursue Norwegian policy aims. But in some cases, it has been necessary to adapt to the EU rules. Now, we expect that the development of increasingly closer integration into the EU will continue at a steadily increased pace. And the developments within the EU are the main drivers. Norway's agreement with the EU agreements are not drawn up to develop new rules. They are drawn up to incorporate existing EU rules and policies. This has been a deliberate policy on Norway's part. Norway's cooperation with the EU has evolved because a broad political majority has wanted it to. While the question of Norwegian membership of the EU has been and still is one of the most contentious issues in Norwegian politics, there has been little dispute over Norway's association with the EU since 1994. The EEA agreement and the other agreements have been a compromise that nearly all the political parties have been able to live with, and they have provided a basis for stable coalition governments one after another. On the whole, successive majorities in parliament and in governments have in practice pursued the same policy of increasing Norway's integration in European cooperation. The drafters of the report see a paradox, and that is that while all the curves for the actual extent of Norway's association with the EU have been steadily rising in the period from 1994 until last year when the report was finished, the political and public debate and the media coverage and the general knowledge in this area have not increased, and in some areas it has even decreased. Lack of debate on Europe is, of course, not an exclusive Norwegian problem. But Norway may, according to the views of those who drafted this report, have a particular challenge for two reasons. One is that there are aspects of the Norwegian form of association with the EU that makes it difficult to comprehend the true nature and extent of Norway-EU relations. And this has dampened political involvement and public debate. And the second reason is that there is still the continuing disagreement about EU membership, which has a similar effect. And maybe I should say a little bit more about that, because the question of Norwegian EU membership has been divisive in almost all the Norwegian political parties. The question has not been decided along party lines, but more along the lines of each individual party member's personal choice and preferences. This is probably the most important reason why, although the governments have been in favor of Norway applying for EU membership all the times we have done so, the government has not really waged a very effective campaign aimed at getting Norway into the Union. And the reason has been that some of the political parties could actually have split if the government had been pushing too hard for the party members to be loyal and follow the party line. They have rather been ready to accept that this has to be a personal choice than risk splitting the parties, which is understandable in politics, of course, but which made for a debate which many see as lacking in political leadership. And that is part, I think, of the explanation why we had a result where a very slim majority of the Norwegians voted against Norway joining the EU. Maybe I would also like to take the opportunity to try to kill another myth which is rather persistent, and that is Norway voted no to membership because we did not want to pay our share of the membership fee or support Europe. That is not correct in my view. I've heard that argument many times outside Norway. In Norway, it never played a role in the discussion about membership. We have always known that if we were to become members of the EU, we would be a net contributor. And I think that would be fine with Norwegians. We have no problem with being a net contributor. We contribute to a lot of causes where that is our role to pay. I think the reason why we did not join had to do with a lot of other explanations rather than economy. Except in one sense, our economy was so good that we could choose. We could do exactly what we wanted. And so we chose for reasons of principle. Personally, and this is not necessarily the government's view, but I do believe myself that a main reason why Norwegians, or the majority of Norwegians, voted no to join the EU twice in referendums was that Norway has a scattered population spread out over a long country with many people living outside cities, and they feel that the distance is long to Oslo. The distance is much longer to Brussels. And they don't like decisions being made in Oslo. They like even less to the thought of having decisions made in Brussels. In addition, the discussion in Norway, both times we had referenda, they aimed at trying to understand what will EU membership mean for Norway. What will be the result for me, for my family, for Norwegians as such? That is a very ambitious task. It is not easy to try to comprehend what will be the result of the comprehensive agreements on the table. Nobody can really understand it. And then I think it's probably a normal human reaction that you become a bit reluctant if you cannot fully comprehend what you're dealing with. The reaction is then that since I don't understand it fully, maybe it's better to vote no and stay with what we know, what we have. And I think that is probably the main reason why a majority of Norwegians did vote no to join the EU. I might also add that while the EU has at times experienced major changes and considerable ups and downs, Norway's form of association has turned out to be surprisingly stable and flexible. At the time, it is also a vulnerable structure. Norway's current form of association is contingent on two equally vital factors. The first is that it is underpinned by a political compromise. And as a political compromise, it has lasted for a long time. There is no indication that this political compromise is at risk. But there are at times signs of strain and dissension. We could, if there is a new fundamental debate on our relations with the EU, we could have a renewed discussion which would result in renewed authority and legitimacy for our form of association with the EU, but it could also end up with a loss of support. And secondly, Norway's association with the EU depends on external circumstances that are largely beyond Norway's control. And by that I mean that they will at all times depend on developments in the EU, where we do not take part in the decision making. What is in addition to mention is that the EU has announced that it too will have a review of its cooperation with Norway through the EEA agreement, and how that will turn out, we don't know yet. So that means there are some vulnerabilities, there are some possible problems, there are constant institutional tensions due to the fact that the EU is developing, while the framework for the EEA agreement is more static. Although, I would add, even if there is static elements or are static elements, there are also some dynamic elements which makes it a fairly unusual international agreement. There is also the fact that the EEA agreement was originally designed for 7 EFTA countries, but the political developments has resulted in the agreement applying only to the 3 smallest of those 7 members. But the underlying substance is probably less vulnerable. In fact, most European countries have been through far-reaching integration processes in the past few decades. The economies of the European countries are more closely interwoven than ever before, and it has become easier to work, travel, do business and study across borders. Ties have been forged at all levels of society. Norway has taken part in these developments in its own special way. For 20 years we have followed the processes in the EU 1 or 2 steps behind, sometimes perhaps a step to the side. I believe that Norway will continue to do so in the years to come. Whether the trend in Europe is to move towards closer integration or to follow another path. Thank you.
Tusen tack, and thank you for your presentation. The last presentation of this block is Iceland's EU accession process state of play, presented by Mr. Stefan Skaldersson.
Well, thank you very much. And first I would like to say that I'm glad that I was able to come to Prague and participate in this seminar or conference. And thank you for coming. Nice to see all the young people showing interest in the Nordics, and including Iceland. And thank also to my Nordic colleagues in Prague for helping or assisting me or rather making this possible for me to participate, because as you may know, I am in Vienna on a daily basis, and actually I came in from the United States this morning and I'm a bit jet-lagged, so if I say something stupid, it is due to that, I hope. My little speech here today will be focused on the application of Iceland to become a member of the European Union. And I will try to be concise. I will start by saying something about where Iceland is coming from and why we are applying. And then I will go a little bit into where we stand in the accession process. And then what will be the key issues for the accession talks. And then the question, do we really want to join? Because there have been indications in my country that the public is not very supportive, for the time being at least. And then maybe a few words on what sort of a member Iceland would be in the EU. First, a little bit on history. Iceland is, of course, a country in Europe, although we are at the fringes of Europe, while the Czech Republic is in Central Europe. We are still Europeans. Our history goes back 1,000 years or more, and our culture, our identity, our history, our literature, everything in our conception of ourselves is European. We sometimes hear allegations that we are more American than European, but this is completely wrong, because our culture is very much shaped by European mainstream culture. Iceland was established already in 930 by instituting a parliament and a commonwealth, which existed for more than 300 years before it became a part of the Norwegian kingdom and later the Danish kingdom for 600 years. So our sort of conception of what we are is that, or rather what Europe is that our recently regained independence in 1918 and the establishment of Republic in 1994, it's only 70 to 90 years since these events happened. So we are a very young republic, but an old country, so to speak. In 1918, when we got independence, we declared perpetual neutrality in terms of and that Iceland would never participate in war. This, of course, did not hold longer than up to World War II, and in 1944, when we declared republic, it was in the midst of the war, and Denmark was occupied by Germany. Like most European countries, after the war, we have participated in most European processes to build institutions in Europe to sustain peace and democratic development. And Iceland joined the OECD in 1947, NATO in 1949, EFTA in 1970, EEA in 1994, Schengen in 1996, and now we have applied for membership of the EU. I could have added that we also became members of the Council of Europe in 1949 and the Nordic cooperation in 1956. Our application to the EU can be described as a continuation of this process. It's natural for a country like mine to join other European countries in their ambition of building a peaceful, secure and prosperous Europe. We have been reluctant to apply until the financial crisis hit my country in 2008, which ended the period of the then government of Social Democrats and Conservatives. And the new government was instituted upon a condition from the Social Democrats that we would apply for membership of the EU, because on the one hand our currency collapsed, and on the other hand, in order to be able to sustain an independent currency, it will be impossible for 300,000 people in an open financial market, as the markets are working today, or did, and still are working. It's impossible for such a small economy to be a part of a financial community through the agreement. That was the understanding in 2009 when we decided to apply. That one of the main reasons was that we needed a secure currency, the euro. This is, of course, a difficult thing to do now after the collapse, because our finances, of course, they were hurt very badly through the crisis. But the motive is, of course, we, like any European, we want economic stability, we want democratic welfare state, a Nordic state, insecurity, peaceful, and at the lowest possible level of armaments and warfare. I put up a few points that Iceland has already adopted about 2/3 of the EU acquis through the EEA agreement. So in a way, we are, as Norway, not a member, but applying most of the acquis, meaning that it is the internal market, the four freedoms, basically, in addition to the Schengen Agreement. So in a sense, we should be very well prepared for accession and negotiations. The financial crisis has led to that we had to suspend the financial the part of the acquis that relates to financial services and free flow of capital, and this suspension is still in force. It cannot be sustained forever, of course, because then it's in breach of the agreement, but it is understood by our partners that this can go on for a while. Now to the more technical side of the issue, application, negotiation, ratification. On 16 July 2009, the Parliament approved a resolution to apply. On 24 February, the EU opinion on Iceland was published, the AVIS. You can read through this. The important dates, you see that this process has been going on now for almost 2.5 years, almost 3 years, and it is going smoothly, I would say, but it is tough. The EU has, in a way, changed the strategy towards new applicants, including with Croatia. Even though we have been applying EU legislation in the internal markets for up to 18 years, the EU insists on scrutinizing every legislation in our country and go through every legislation that has been accepted by the EFTA Surveillance Authority and even the EU itself as a part of the common market legislation. They nevertheless will go through every sentence of it and see if there are any issues. So this is very time-consuming, but it is going. It's done in very, very good spirit and is moving forward fairly well. The situation today is that we have already opened about half. Opened 15 chapters of 35, and 10 have already been closed again. And this is an overview of the situation. Chapters covered by the EEA, partially covered by the EEA, and not covered by the EEA. And, well, the colors are very bad on the picture. There should be colors. I don't know why they're not. But even the parts covered by the EEA, there are several chapters still being negotiated or gone through because even free movement of goods, which has been in existence for 18 years, the EU is not yet completely gone through that one. But it is being worked out, and we are hoping, we aim at opening all chapters this year and try to close as many as possible. I will not bore you with the technical aspects, just go, yeah, and then there we get the colors. Okay, this is that technical. It's not important really. If for end of 2012, hope that all chapters are green or orange. Now, the key issues in our negotiations will be, no surprise, fisheries, which is not only economically important, it's also politically very important in my country. If we look at our fisheries sector and relate it to other European countries, Icelanders produce about 5 tons of fish per head, per individual. And of European Union production is about 4.5 million tons, while Iceland is 1.5 million. So if Iceland were to join the European Union, we would be the biggest fisheries country in the Union. Of course, we realize that there is no exceptions from the rules. But we will negotiate and of course, and as good as we can. Our point is that, and I think Central Europeans as well as others in Europe can agree, the European fisheries policy has not been very successful through the last 20 years. And I could say also with Norway, I wouldn't put words in your mouth, Jens, but I think fisheries issues were also difficult in Norway when they were negotiating, and also in the referenda on accession treaties. I have sometimes said to colleagues in Europe that it could be, I think Brussels could think about it. There is no country in Northwest Europe a member. And at least for my country and for Greenland and Faroese, it is because of fish. And there might be something, there might be a reason for this, because these societies, my country, Greenland, Faroese, we are completely dependent on it. And there is a reason for that skepticism towards management from Europe on a resource that has been managed sustainably for a long time. And that would also include Norway, which has a very good management system as well. So I think it's a food for thought in the negotiating process, and also in terms of developing the EU fisheries policy, that one should engage in a serious discussion on how to solve this issue. Another issue, agriculture, is very important also in my country, mostly because of regional aspects of it. Iceland is self-sustained in terms of meat production and dairy production, and even in most basic vegetables due to greenhouse growing in greenhouses. That chapter is, of course, difficult. The climate in Iceland is not very healthy for traditional agricultures. So, but we believe that this could be solved in a negotiation. Monetary affairs, as I said, our capital markets are closed, our currency markets are regulated for the time being. This was done in cooperation with the IMF. And about a third of our GDP, or the value of a third of our GDP, is owned by foreign investors in Icelandic kronas in Iceland. So if we would open the currency markets, the rallying against the krona would be probably put the value another 50% down. So the central bank is trying to make this softly, and we are adamant that we will, in the end, come around. And actually, the economy is rising again. And if you look at it in European terms, our public debt is similar to Germany. Our income per head is similar to Germany, Sweden. So it's not all that bad. So you just have to get through this currency problems, then we are back on track again. And I think if we learned a lesson, I think we will develop a sound financial system on the ruins of the one that went bust. Cod, sheep, and krona. Does Iceland want to join the EU? This is a tricky question before the collapse in 2008, we had consistent majority for application and for accession even. The first half year after the crack, there was still a majority for accession, but then things developed in politics where EU was blamed for collapse and not the other way around. And then things started to develop in a different way, but what is today, you can say that there is consistently a big majority, about 65%, that support negotiations, accession negotiations, while there is consistently about 35% against negotiations. But if you ask, would you like to join the European Union, you would have about 65% against and 35% for. So there is a big margin between those opinions, and I think we are looking at a situation where the outcome of negotiations and the explanations of what a treaty, accession treaty would include would be very, very important for the outcome of any referenda, because we will have a referendum. Not because it is constitutionally required, but because it is politically decided. So, in addition, politics in my country are in shambles after the crack. Only under 10% of the population trust the parliament, as things stand today. So, and the parliament, it was a parliamentary resolution to seek agreement on accession. So, yes, firm support for negotiations, and no, not support for accession now. But then we don't have an accession treaty. We don't know what it will be. So, then, why are we applying? As I said in the beginning, we are a European country, we are a peaceful country, we are a democratic country, we are deeply, we have human rights are very much a part of our culture and our law. One of the chapters that was finalized quite quickly was exactly on the human rights side. We have a parliamentary tradition, democratic tradition that is 1100 years old. So we, in a way, belong to Europe in that sense. But then, on the other hand, we have also this culture of being an independent country, sovereign country, standing on our own feet, not giving anything to foreigners. We should keep our resources for ourselves, etc. So we have these balancing arguments, classical arguments about what sovereignty is and what it isn't. So I hope this has clarified some of the points regarding our accession ambition, and I hope for a lively discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I hope that I pronounce it well. Thakathier, is it right?
Sorry?
Thakathier, is it right? Like, thank you? No?
Thakathier, yeah. Sure.
Okay. So, thank you very much for your presentations. And now I'd like to open the discussion. There will be collected about 3 questions in a round, and we shall see how many rounds we make. So please, I ask the questioner to be introduced and passed a query direct to the speaker. And please consider also the length of your questions. So, are there any questions? Yes, Lukáš? Mikrofon. Zkuste to nahoru dát.
Good afternoon, everyone, once again. As I said, I'm from Young Conservatives from Czech Republic, And my question is towards the countries, Your Excellencies from the countries as EU members. As a week ago, we had a Chancellor, Angela Merkel. We had her here in Czech Republic, and she said that more powers of the governments of the governments of different states are going to be forwarded to the Brussels. And my question is, what's the attitude of the governments if they are still willing to forward these powers, such as social benefits and so on, to the EU, or they would prefer to stay have more sovereignty? Thank you very much.
Another question about sovereignty or something else? Yeah, Mr. Brunclík.
My question is related to Sweden. Do you hear me? Perhaps for Mr. Bengtsson and for Mrs. Jagander. At the moment, Sweden has a very pro-European government formed by 4 center-right parties, and if I speculate, after next elections, if Social Democrat opposition takes over, do you think that there will be any significant foreign policy change by government, Social Democratic government? Can we expect any change of the attitude towards European integration? Thank you.
Thank you. And there are 2 questions. Okay, so the man in yellow pullover.
I work for many years for Lidový dům.
Please, can you introduce yourself, please?
Foreigner. I received a brochure here, and there is a very interesting sentence. There is a demand inside the EU to balance the Franco-German engine with the alternative leadership structures. And my question is, what's your feeling about the future French president, François Hollande, which I think will end this contemporary structure? By the way, it was the Berlin dictate, not a French-German engine in the last year. Therefore, what's your feeling about these tendencies inside the Socialist International, inside the socialist parties? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we have our 3 questions. So please, can you take it somehow? Yeah.
All right. Is this working? Yes. The first question related to whether Sweden would be prepared to transfer more power to Brussels. I think the answer is yes and no. Yes, when it relates to areas where we see the need for that. Obviously, environmental issues transcends borders, things like that. That's those sort of issues that can only be resolved by working together at the level of Brussels. The answer would be no when it comes to certain areas where we think the domestic national governments should keep their sovereignty. One issue would be taxation, but at a general level we are generally in favor of subsidiarity. Difficult word to pronounce, but the principle is sound. That the issues should be, when necessary and when it's good for the cause, so to speak, be decided at the level which is the appropriate level for that particular issue and the lowest possible level. Regarding the question about whether the Swedish government, if there is a change of power and the Social Democrats return to power at the next elections, whether there will be a very significant power shift or a shift in the view towards Europe, I think the basic answer is no. I think To some extent, it is true that the Social Democrats remain a little cooler in their relationship to the European Union. But on the other hand, now we are so ingrained in Europe, it's taken for granted, it's not really questioned, except for some rather marginal forces in Sweden. So my basic assumption would be no significant change. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other ambassador will answer? No? Yeah, Mr. Bengtsson.
We agree with what Sweden just said.
Okay. Mr. Bengtsson?
Just to comment on the second question there on the Swedish opposition, I agree completely with the interpretation here that all the major issues are fundamentally settled in the Swedish perspective, is my interpretation here. Although a question like, should we forward more powers to the EU in new areas, maybe an issue where this government would be somewhat more proactive than a social democratic alternative. So I think it's maybe on the visionary level rather than on let's say, the realpolitik level of already existing competences. So in that light, it may sort of feed into this idea of where is the European process going, rather than being a question of functional cooperation. Is this area good or not?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mr. Kjellberg?
No, on the first question, just to say that we actually agree with you.
Can you?
I think it is on.
Yeah,
okay.
It works.
No, just on the first question, to say that we agree with Sweden, that it depends. It has always been a delicate question in the domestic debate in Denmark, and I think in all Nordic countries, how much power, how much integration, and so on, are we going to see a EU in two-step EU developments within the Eurozone and another EU outside the Eurozone and so on. There's a lot of debate, so it depends. I think that's the short version of the answer.
Okay, thank you. If there are no comments, I'd like to ask the audience again for their questions. Yeah, Dalibor, there, guy with glasses.
Hello, my name is Dalibor Zitka. I'm a student from CEVRO Institute. I would like to ask directly to His Excellency from Iceland on the current relations between Iceland and Great Britain, because as we know, there were some problems in history, like Cold Wars, and in the recent years there were.
Sorry, I don't hear you what you say.
That I would like to ask on the current relations with Great Britain. Between Iceland and Great Britain, because there were some problems in the past, like Cold Wars, and in the recent years, financial crisis, and Gordon Brown made some very hard marks on the Iceland part. So I would like to ask on the current relations with Great Britain.
Well, thank you for the question. The Cold Wars are over. We have a new one called Mackerel. I think we will negotiate on that one. I think the kind of diplomacy on fisheries resources is history now. We have a lot to see. We have agreements. We have research institutions to manage sustainability of things. Of course, in politics, everything is connected to everything, like famous Norwegian Prime Minister once said, Rikard Bengtsson, in a debate. Today, as we negotiate accession agreement with the EU, we have a disagreement on the management of the one straddling fish stock. We see it as a completely different question. It is unacceptable from the point of view of accession negotiation to connect such an issue with that process. There is no alternative to agreement on the management of that stock. But the problem lies in a way in that, and I know Norway is on my left-hand side here, you know, fish, they do not ask where they want to eat. They just come to the table. And the mackerel has been coming massively into Icelandic exclusive economic zone during the last 10, 15 years, and more every year, probably because of climate change. So how can you tell fishermen not to fish something within the economic zone, which is there? I mean, how can you refuse a fisherman to fish on a stock that is inside an exclusive economic zone of the country? On the other hand, of course, this is a straddling fish stock, and it has to be managed collectively and with full responsibility. And we are trying to reach agreement with the EU, Norway, and Russia on that. There is no hot wars but negotiation.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Hello, I'm Martin Benda. I'm long-term active in some different Nordic associations, as it is Nordic Society or the Scandinavian House or even the Club of Icelandic Fanatics. So I have a question to all of you five ambassadors or diplomats. I have a long experience with embassies on the cultural policies and events, festivals, Nordic film festivals, and etc. And I wasn't really satisfied with that in the last, let's say, 5 years. I didn't see much of effective cooperation between you five. We had to do it individually with each state separately. So I would like to ask you for some evaluation of your common Nordic cultural policy or public policy in the Czech Republic. Thank you.
So who will take this answer?
Okay, now they're working both. I think the main reason is probably that each embassy has its own cultural budget, and I don't know how the budget cycle is among all countries, and maybe that is something we should discuss to see if there are possibilities to cooperate a little bit closer. But what we usually do is we sit in our own little boxes and we look at applications, and there, I can tell you there are many applications. We are flooded with applications for good projects to support in the cultural field. There are really a lot of cultural activities going on in this country, and I would say generally they are very worthy of support. And when it comes to Nordic activities, we sometimes cooperate, and I think most often it is true, as was said here in the question, that we do not cooperate on specific activities. So I think maybe you have posed a question that we should discuss a little bit among ourselves whether we could improve in this particular area. Thank you.
So thank you. So are there, okay, one more. The last question, I think.
To His Excellency from Norway, do you feel more free in making free trade agreements because you are out of the European Union, or would you feel better if you will be in the European Union in terms, for example, if you try to make some free trade agreement, do you see it as advantage be out of the European Union?
I'm not sure if I fully understood the question, but we don't need free trade agreements within to cooperate with any country that is an EU member country or an EEA member country. So to the extent we negotiate free trade agreements, it's only with countries outside the EEA, the European Economic Area. And when it comes to that, I don't really think it matters whether we are a member of the EU or, as in Norway's case, outside the EU. Our economic links with the European Union are so close that in the economic area, for all practical matters, we could or should be considered as practically being members of the EU. So we take part in negotiations in the EFTA context because that is our forum, but I believe that is really not as much a question of our relations with the EU as it is about the relations between EFTA and the countries we negotiate free trade agreements with.
Okay, thank you very much for your contributions. And if there are no any answers to the questions, so I'd like to thank you, all our speakers. Thank you very much for being here. And after a small coffee break, we meet here to open the second block. So thank you very much.